Hello and welcome to the DME podcast, brought to you by DME, the podcast booking platform. Whether you're a podcaster or an aspiring guest, the DME app is a perfect platform for you to get booked and manage your podcast bookings. I'm your host, Sukhay, the founder of DME, and on this podcast we'll be discussing the latest news and views in tech, the ins and outs of entrepreneurship, and even dipping our toes into the adrenaline-filled world of mixed martial arts. On this week's podcast, I catch up with Iona Italia. Iona is currently the managing editor of Quillette, an online magazine based out of Australia, which specialises in long-form analysis and cultural commentary. Iona has a vast array of experience as an author, writer and podcaster, and if you've ever followed her on social media, you'll know she isn't afraid to express an opinion or two. In this episode, we discuss Iona's early works in the study of writing and journalism within the envelope of Enlightenment values. We cover Iona's thoughts on the current state of public discourse, her fear, loathing and admiration of all things Elon Musk, and we also get into our own podcasting hall of fame. You'll have to forgive the first opening 30 seconds, where we start off on a tangent discussing Olympic of all things, but we soon get back on track before the next inevitable tangent. Iona is always a fascinating listen, and you can find her work and various socials at ionaitalia.com, so please enjoy Iona Italia. Iona Italia, welcome to the DME podcast.
Thank you so much, Suk. It's a pleasure to see your little face again
Not so little, I'm afraid.
be on this podcast. It's not? You haven't got onto Ozempic? The Ozempic
I'm
craze?
doing the Wegovy one. So
Oh, Wegovy, yeah.
upon
Oh,
your
brilliant.
recommendation and upon your medical advice.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah, it's the same thing. Wegovy and Ozempic are exactly the same thing, but I think the Wegovy, the marketing is different, so they're able to charge more for it. So,
Well, yeah, I justify it a little bit by saying my food bill is cut in half, so I don't consume as much. So
Yeah.
it's costing me half
Oh,
as much as the retail price.
It's 100% worth it. I'm also doing it here in Australia. I'm actually doing Ozempic
Mhm.
because, don't mess with the classics.
Of course.
But it's it's much cheaper here in Australia than in the UK. It's about in Australia it's Ozempic, if you're on the full dose, it is 200 Australian dollars, which is about £100 a month.
Okay, that's about 50%
And I'm
cheaper.
actually taking a 3/4 dosage, so it's actually £100 for 6 weeks, which I feel is extremely worth it. Yeah,
Much cheaper
and
than gym
probably
membership.
much more effective, at least for losing weight. Yeah, and probably if you add up all the little times that you're out and about and you feel hungry and you just buy a little snack or something, if you totted all of those up, I bet they would come to £100 in 6 weeks easily.
Very easily, yeah. So when I started it, I quickly kind of realised that I wasn't buying any lunches, which was kind of £10 a pop, which equates to about 80 quid a week. So I thought, there's half the price
Yeah,
of the cost
exactly.
of it. So anyway, this is kind of the reason.
You're going to be so svelte and sexy.
Yes, I don't know about that. We're far too old for that. Well, this is kind of the reason I invited you onto the podcast, is just to kind of explore your brain, because having followed you for years, and obviously we've been familiar for a few years now, you have opinions and experiences and thoughts which I kind of find fascinating. I don't always agree with you, but I do appreciate your brain. So do you want to give us a quick TLDR into Iona Italia?
Oh my God. Let me see. So I was conceived. No, I won't go back quite that far. I was born in the UK, but I spent my early childhood in Pakistan because my father was he was born in India, later went to live in Pakistan. He was a Parsi, and my mother was Scottish. So then I came to the UK slightly later, or came back to the UK. I was born in the UK, but I went straight to Pakistan as a very small infant. And then I studied English literature at uni, and that was a great start, but then I overdid it by staying for a PhD. And I did my PhD on 18th century journalism. Then I worked in academe for about 11 years, and I lived in a bunch of different countries. And then in 2006, I made one of many rash decisions that I've made that seemed like a good idea at the time, which is that I packed in my academic job and I went to Buenos Aires in order to dance tango.
Mm-hmm.
And I became a tango teacher. And I did that for another decade. And then in 2016, I was having a midlife crisis, I guess, because being a tango teacher is a very precarious living, as people can probably imagine. And I decided that I needed to do something else with my life, and I also wanted to get back in touch with my Parsi roots. So I spent about a year and a half, I think it was 2 years cumulatively, in India, in Bombay. And whilst I was there, I did teach tango, but I knew I wouldn't be able to make a living from teaching tango in India. So through social media, actually, I encountered this guy who was running a magazine called Arrow Magazine, and we followed each other on Twitter, and he commissioned me to write something for the magazine. I wrote a few pieces for the magazine, and then later Helen Pluckrose, who I had become friendly with over Twitter, took over as editor-in-chief of that magazine, and I became Helen hired me as the copy editor. Then in 2020, Helen decided to leave the magazine, partly to do other things and partly because the magazine was in really bad financial straits. And she was thinking of closing the magazine, but she said, I could instead just give it to you, Iona. You could take it over and try to make it work. So once again, in my history of rash decisions, I decided to do that. So I ran the magazine for a few years, earning very little money indeed, really struggling. And then in 2023, early 2023, I came to Australia, which is another story in itself. And I got myself a job at the magazine Quillette, and I managed to get an Australian work visa, and I have now emigrated to Australia. So
I can't imagine a bigger smile on your face.
I love living here in Australia. I love it.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, so I obviously follow you on Twitter, and I kind of followed your journey over the last few years since I've been following you. And I'm fascinated by kind of your background and kind of all the various things you've done. And I was trying to come up with a couple of themes for this chat, because I wanted to do a podcast with you for a while, just because I think you're a great guest and very interesting. So I was like, how can I frame this? What do I call it, Iona? She's done all these things, got all these titles. So I kind of come up with, well, she's a bit of a Renaissance woman, isn't she? Without actually knowing what a Renaissance woman would be. So I'm going to ask you, how fitting do you think that description would be?
So I think of a Renaissance man or woman as being someone who is equally skilled equally skilled in arts and sciences, and that is definitely not me.
I beg to differ.
I don't think I have no background in science, and I have no skill in science at all. I've never done science in any way. I am very interested in certain aspects of science in particular. I love evolutionary biology, and I'm a long-term fan of Richard Dawkins. And I've read a lot of popular science books, mostly on evolutionary biology, and a few other subjects as well. And I'm also a space travel enthusiast, and I'm a sci-fi enthusiast as well. So I would personally love to go to Mars. I'm ready if Elon needs any volunteers. I'm happy to go. I know it's quite a long trip, and it will probably turn out to be one of those many rash decisions I've made should I ever go. But I would love that. And I definitely want to see people land on Mars in my lifetime. So I guess I have an interest in science, but maths makes me cry. And I definitely have never been any kind of scientist or adjacent to science in any way. In fact, most of my life I've been on the opposite pole, as far away from being scientific as it's possible to get.
Well, under your definition, you may not fit the description, but for me, you do.
Oh, thank you. I'll take it.
So
You
wanted
should
to move
never
on a
argue
little
with
bit.
a compliment.
There we go. It might be the last one you get. Just to move on then, I know you've written a lot about Enlightenment values as part of your dissertation, was that right? I think you kind of underplayed it a little bit, so you did English literature at university. It was Cambridge University, wasn't it?
Yes.
There we go.
I loved it at Cambridge.
So on the Enlightenment, could you kind of summarize your work on the Enlightenment philosophy and why that was so important at the time?
Yeah, so it wasn't so much the Enlightenment philosophy that I studied as, although I have described myself in the past as an Enlightenment liberal, and I am definitely, I think Enlightenment values are very important to me. And I love that period because of the enormous flourishing of rationality so let me see. What I was studying for my PhD were the first journalists. So I'm going to go back a little bit before the 18th century. In 1660, during towards the end of the English Civil War, 1694, there was a licensing act in England. And it's in England where journalism really started. And by journalism, I mean regular, unbound publications coming out daily, weekly, or monthly, as opposed to what you had before were chapbooks and pamphlets, and those were written in response to some specific occasion. And they were like a kind of activist political flyer. They were really more like that. Whereas this idea of an unbound publication that's regularly commenting on politics and society and culture and things, that started in the 1690s in the UK. And it began then because up until 1694, there had been a licensing act in place, and that meant that everything that was published had to first go through the official censors. So it was pre-publication censorship. And also, there was a limit to the number of printing presses that you were allowed to have. So only, I think, Oxford, Cambridge, the Inns of Court, so the legal printing press, the Crown, and I think Edinburgh also had one. There were only 7 or 8 in total printing presses in the country, and all of them were controlled by the state in the broader sense. And after that legislation lapsed in 1694, in the meanwhile, there'd also been some technological developments which made it just easier and more practical to set up and run a printing press. And suddenly, printing presses just sprang up everywhere. And if you're already printing books, you always have, if you were using the old technology, you always had some spare pieces of paper lying around. So you could use those pieces of paper to print something unbound and sent that off cheaply to be read. And these things were read, a lot of them were read in coffee houses. So people would go to the coffee house and the newspapers and periodicals would be there, and they would read them there in the coffee house and chat and discuss things. It was the early internet, was going to the coffee house and shooting the breeze with people there. So I wrote my PhD on the writers of those early periodicals.
Okay, that's fine. I didn't actually know any of that, so that's fascinating. So obviously, you mentioned that's the early stages of the internet and obviously public discourse. How do you think obviously, I know you comment a lot on this on your own Twitter feed. The public discourse over the last 10 years or so, if not a little bit more, has become quite fractious. How far away do you think modern journalism or modern discourse has gone away from those original roots of kind of sharing free expression of ideas as bestowed by the Enlightenment?
Well, I think that political discourse has always been very fractious, and when journalism began in the UK, it was not that long ago that they had a revolution in 1688 and deposed the king, and there were to be some quite ferocious battles fought in the 18th century over the British monarchy and control over the British state. There were also, or I should say, at that point it was still the English state, because it didn't become a British state until 1707, towards the beginning of my period. So there were some very major conflicts, and that in a sense we are less fractious now than we were then, because we're not actually fighting any kind of civil war. It is unlikely that war is going to break out in the UK and you're going to end up fighting other Brits.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, it's less fractious, and I would say that also it's more free, even though we don't have optimum free speech by any means, and there is always a human tendency towards censorship, because people have never found it comfortable to hear other people saying either rude or bad things about them. No one wants that. Or saying things that are inconvenient to their worldview,
Mm-hmm.
or that contradict their worldview, whether those things are true or not. So people are there's always this impulse to silence people if you are able to. So that we have to fight back against that constantly. But I think speech is a bit freer than it was during the Enlightenment, because in the Enlightenment they still had seditious libel, and that could include criticizing members of the government. They still also had blasphemy and obscenity laws on the books, and those were often interpreted in quite a broad way. But what they didn't have anymore is pre-publication censorship. So your book or newspaper could be impounded, and this did happen. People could come round to the printers' offices and destroy your printing press. You might have to flee the country. You might even end up in prison. However, it's much more difficult to put genies back into bottles. So when you move from pre to post publication censorship, you already have a great increase in freedom.
Yeah, so how do you think that translates to kind of the modern way of doing things? Because if you took a straw poll, I think most people would think that it's really fractious at the moment. But obviously, you're putting it in the historical context and just zooming out a little bit. So actually, it's been a lot worse.
It's been much worse. I think it was much worse also in the US, for example, in the 60s and 70s. People forget, I think, just how just how bitterly divided the country was during the Vietnam era,
Yeah.
and the McCarthy era. So actually, we've become more fractious than we were 5 years ago. So it feels to us like we're down in a dip, but it's only a local indentation.
That's a good way of looking at it, because I've kind of view history as a timeline. If you do view the timeline, you can see the spikes below, above and below the line, when things are good or things are bad, and then the small dip in indentation probably is a right reflection, I think. Just moving on then. Obviously we kind of also talked about your kind of media roles with Area Magazine and with your own Substack, Second Swim. That's right, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes, it's much neglected, unfortunately. I do encourage people to go and read it, because it's not about current affairs. It's just creative writing, so it's not going to go out of date. But I haven't been writing on the Substack very much lately.
But you
I've
have
just
got,
been too busy and writing elsewhere.
we all have those pressures, but obviously you do have multiple avenues for your creativity, be that your own podcasts. You've got a podcast with Quillette, your own articles that you're writing. You kind of mentioned to me a little bit earlier that you're obviously preparing for give a big speech as well, and
A small speech.
small speech. Well, it'll be big by the time you've written it. So what are the biggest challenges of trying to have a presence across all these various form factors for kind of a content creator? And I'd classify you as kind of an influencer personality in certain circles.
That's a really good question. It's a very good question. I think that it's there's always for me a trade-off between how much I want to be reading and writing and mouthing off online, which I just cannot help doing. If I have a thought, then I feel I've got to share it with the world. And Twitter is the best avenue for doing that. And then articles are also a good articles and podcasts are also a good avenue for doing that. And not wanting to live my life entirely online, because I want to have some work-life balance, really. And it's a little bit tough because I enjoy being online so much, and I even enjoy blocking trolls. It feels like it gives me a kind of OCD-ish pleasure when I've posted something and I see some absolutely horrible responses, and I'm able to just go block, 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 block. I actually love that. Weirdly enough.
Do you bait them at all?
Not really. I think that I'm just naturally baity, because I have quite a controversial. I have some views that I think should not be controversial, but happen to be controversial, and I people are often surprised by this because I'm quite soft-spoken and I'm pretty agreeable in real life, but in my opinions I'm extremely disagreeable. And by that I mean that if I think something, I feel a really strong urge to say it, not necessarily in, private circles, but in public, even when I know that no good will come of saying it. No one else will be convinced. It's going to cause issues and might be unwise, but nevertheless, my urge is extremely strong.
Yeah.
I find it hard to have a filter. Certainly in public situations.
It's one of my surprising things when I first came across your feed. But I think I first heard you on a fellow podcast many, many, many years ago. I thought, I like the way Iona thinks. So I kind of followed you on Twitter. Then I thought, the spoken voice of Iona on podcast versus her Twitter voice is quite extreme on both ends of the spectrum here. But I thought, wow, she's feisty. So she's very interesting.
Yeah,
So
I mean, I've got a soft voice, and also as people can tell, I'm not the most fluent speaker. I'm really envious of those people who just seem to speak in full paragraphs. Someone like Glenn Lowry is a person who immediately comes to mind.
yeah.
I don't have that. I'm a terrible and and I find it hard to think on my feet in that way. There's going back to those early journalists. There's a couple of journalists called Addison and Steele, Joseph Addison, Richard Steele. They wrote two famous publications called The Tatler and The Spectator. No connection with the current day publications of those names. The Tatler is actually more fun than The Spectator in my view, because I love Steele's writing in particular. And Steele said of Joseph Addison that he was a man who could write you a cheque for £10,000, but did not have sixpence in spare change in his pocket. And what he meant by that was that Addison was a really witty and fluent writer, but he was a very tongue-tied and awkward speaker. And I'm not exactly like Addison in that I'm not quite as tongue-tied and awkward in speech, and I'm also not quite as witty and fluent in writing, but I empathize with that very much.
So coming on to some of your podcasts, I know you've kind of interviewed a wide range of people and many intellectuals. Is there any moments in your podcast that you've kind of learned something and gone, oh wow, I never knew that before? Any kind of oh wow moments on in your podcast that you've done recently?
Oh my goodness, I think it's hard to think of a podcast where I haven't had those kinds of moments.
Mm-hmm.
I've just done a very long podcast. So my podcasts are usually about an hour and a half, but I just got carried away with the last podcast that I was doing, and we ended up talking for nearly 3 hours. It'll probably be about 2.5 hours once we've made some edits. To this guy called he's pseudonymous, so I'll just refer to him as the pseudonym. I do know who he is. He's an independent scholar of early Australia, and his pseudonym is Mungo Manic. And he was just telling me endless, fascinating detail about the lives of the Aboriginal Australians in pre-colonial Australia. So I think it's very frequent that I'm surprised by things that guests tell me. Even when I've read their work, there are usually some surprises that come out in conversation that aren't actually in the written materials, which is one of the beauties of podcasting, right?
Yeah, that's the whole point, right? There's no point interviewing someone who you know exactly all the responses is going to give you, because it's not interesting for you, and I don't think it'd be interesting for the audience either. Literally, the last podcast I did was about cultural and evolutionary systems in AI. And I went into it thinking one thing, and Dr. James Borg, who was a guest, kind of just blew my mind. I was just struggling to keep up with way beyond my intellectual level. So I kind of go, right, I have to dumb this down a little bit, and let's not get above our station. So is there any interviews or guests that you'd like to have on your podcast if you haven't done so yet? I think, have you done Richard Dawkins, I believe? I think
yes. Yeah. That was definitely my favorite podcast. It was an honor. Let me think. I think the dream guest would be Elon Musk.
Okay. Interesting. He's quite the controversial figure these days.
Yeah, I'm not sure how. I think that I would want to keep him on the topics that interest me. So I'm not a big fan of Musk's politics or involvement in politics, and I partly because I just feel it's a distraction from his more important work. But I feel that he has done more than anyone else possibly he's done more than anyone else at the moment to contributed more than anyone else at the moment towards human flourishing, potential human flourishing, with all kinds of things, not just the space stuff, but SpaceX is the big one.
Mm-hmm.
So I would love to talk to him, and I have talked about space travel and Mars on the podcast. I interviewed Robert Zubrin, who's an astrophysicist and an expert on Mars missions.
I think you'd
but I'd love to talk to Elon. Yeah.
I think if you don't make it onto the first trip, I think you should definitely use your voice as the onboard computer. I don't know if you remember Red Dwarf at all.
Yes.
You can make the great voice of the computer, I think. Keep everybody nice and calm on their 1 year journey over to Mars at light speed, or however long it will take.
I'm so sorry, Spook. I'm afraid I cannot do that.
Why not?
I'm afraid I cannot open the bay doors. I'm so sorry.
Say such a nice. We're about to self-destruct. Mission abandoned. So, just kind of following on then. Obviously, you're in your writing.
In case Musk is listening, I'll be happy to do that. I'll be happy to be the voice of the computer. But what I really want is a passage.
I'll try and put a word in for you if I ever get him on the podcast. I'll send him an email. He's normally quite responsive on Twitter, weirdly. But I think you might have to pay a premium subscription first before he responds to you. So going back to kind of your the content creation side of things for you, what kind of advice would you kind of give to kind of youngsters or others who are willing to kind of have a career change and maybe explore their content, their creative side, whether it's writing, dance, journalism, podcasting? How would you advise others to kind of get into that that creative mindset and that creative thought?
Well, first of all, I would say it's really hard to make a living by doing this kind of thing. I feel I'm extremely privileged to now have a salary that's on the low side, but is still a proper adult person's salary. Most people who are working in journalism, frankly, are being paid little or nothing. Many people are working in journalism more or less for free, or they're earning the equivalent of a kind of half-time salary, and they're actually being supported by their families or by spouses. So if that's not your situation, then I would definitely say you need to have another career or another job at least that is paying the bills, and then just you should launch straight in. I think that at the moment with so much AI content out there, it's really important to get your personal voice, your literal physical voice, and also your face out there. So I would highly recommend not just writing, but also having a podcast, reading your own articles, making little videos of yourself reading your articles, developing a fan base with whom you communicate, and even doing local things, especially if you live in a reasonably large town, like having a meetup group or reading group, hosting something on Intellect. Lean into the personal aspects of it, because that's going to become, I think, increasingly valuable with so much AI content out there.
The personal touch. I think that's very good advice. I think obviously we met via a Twitter connection. I think a lot of your wider network has all been via Twitter and online connections that you've kind of turned into real life friendships, haven't you?
Yeah, that's right. That's I usually regard Twitter as, among other things, a source of real life friends.
Mm-hmm.
So I do have a lot of Twitter followers, and that makes it easier. But the way to do this is to begin by commenting on other people's posts, on the posts of people who you like and find interesting. And if you develop a good rapport with them, you should keep a list of who is in which city. Keep track of that. And it's really easy to make lists on Twitter, as you know.
Yeah.
So make a list of the handles of people in different cities. And if you're having a nice conversation with someone who's in your city, drop them a message and say, tell them, you love meeting people from Twitter in real life, and you'd love to have a drink or a coffee with them.
Great advice,
And
Iona.
so that's how I've basically seeded my friend groups here in Australia, and previously in India, in the UK. Wherever I've gone, I've used Twitter, and previously I used to use Facebook for this a lot as well, but I no longer really use Facebook much. But yeah, get those people out of your Twitter DMs and into your WhatsApp, and create a WhatsApp group. In fact, one less, if you feel like it might seem a bit creepy, might seem like there's some, you're sliding into the DMs for some sexual or romantic purposes, then one way to do it is to say, hey, would you like to join my local WhatsApp group? And I often have people over and things like that, and then have a dinner party and invite people in a group to come. So that's also something that I do. I have dinner parties every few months, and invite my friends. Yeah, so start moving as many of your friends as you can from Twitter to real life. And also when if you're visiting a new city or a new place, then have a look and see if any of your Twitter followers are there and try to meet them.
I think we need to find some Martians on your timeline and get them into your WhatsApp group. That's great, Iona. So if people wanted to follow your work, where's the best place they can find you? So we mentioned your Substack, The Second Swim, and on Twitter you are Dr. Iona Italia. Is that right?
It's at Iona Italia, I think. Let me just have a quick look.
We'll pop all the links in the episode description.
I think it's at Iona Italia. And they can also, should go to The Second Swim, which has a lot of my more personal, more literary, more creative writing. And the website for that is also www.ionaitalia.com, I think is the Substack. But also, if you go to Substack and you search my name, or you search The Second Swim, you'll find it. And then you can also find me at Quillette. If you go to the Quillette website, you'll find me there. And you'll find the Quillette podcast there as well, which I host every other week, alternating with my colleague John Kay. And plus, I have a website, which I also need to update. It hasn't been updated for at least a year, but it is out there, and it's also just Iona Italia, I think .com
it's
or
.com.
.net or something. Yeah, .com.
It's .com.
But if you search me, you will find me.
That's
if
great.
you Google, you'll basically find all the places.
Well, I hope to see you back in the UK soon enough. Maybe, if only for a visit. I know you like Australia a little bit too much at the moment.
I love it. And it is a bit expensive coming back. So, but I will be back, of course, at some point. Because otherwise my sister will kill me.
Love to grab another coffee with you when you board back.
That would be great. We must do that.
Thank you for coming on the Dear Me podcast, Iona.
Thank you so much.